It's a giant. There it is. All right. So you guys can see my screen. All right. This was the endpoint that we had last time, and I'm going to get into the reasons why it wasn't working and how to fix it. But before we do that, actually, we had a participant here today who joined us and was talking about Mo, who was talking about how she hated Java from before, but as she's warming up to it, she's she's starting to see some upsides, and I totally get that. I think with most languages, it takes some time to get used to before you can kind of really get into it and understand it, and really get to use it effectively. I think to a lot of people, it's confusing why we have so many different programming languages. Why don't we just stick to one of them, right? It would be so much simpler if the world just revolved around one language and everyone just could learn one and just do everything with it. And so I think I'll give a little bit of a good reasoning for the pros and cons to Java versus, say, C++ or something at a much higher level, such as Python. So with something like Python, for example, it's a very, very simple language. It doesn't require too much training to use, and it allows you to build code very, very rapidly. I must admit, in our company that I work for, we have a bit of something called AWS Lambdas. They're essentially serverless functions, and building very simple functions with Python can be a very, very efficient way to get very, very simple processes going. The problem with something like Python, though, is that because it's so easy to build and how it's so fluid, first of all, it can run into a lot of runtime errors. So what do I mean by that? Say in Java, for example, you have to declare each item that you're about to throw, right? And you have to very, very explicitly define the privacy level of each function and whatnot. I feel like with Python, because it's so liquid, it's so open, you're allowed to, say, create a variable all willy-nilly without even declaring it and stuff like that, which is great in some aspects. But oftentimes, say, if you're running very, very robust code, code that you want to make sure your customers never run issues into, you run into a whole bunch of runtime exceptions and all these other issues simply because during compile time, it's very hard to catch these problems all the way until you actually run into an edge case and you see it. Also, another issue with Python, I think, is that it's because it's such a high-level language, it does take more processing power, more time in order to run. I remember seeing a benchmark some time ago where say if C++ was the fastest, say you rank it at 100 milliseconds to complete a chunk of code, coding the exact same function inside Python would take 200 to 300 milliseconds. So you're looking at maybe a 2 to 3x performance decrease, which isn't too bad in the grand scheme of things. But if you compare with Java, we're looking at around a 30 to 50% decrease from C++. So you're looking at maybe 120 to 150 second about runtime. And so these are all kind of standard benchmarks. Obviously, depending on what functions you run and what libraries you run, it's going to differ, right? But that just kind of gives you more of a general idea. C++ on the other end is extremely quick, but the problem is that you also have to deal with something called memory allocation. And what does that mean? So essentially, for example, here, over here, say you have an integer, over here you have a string. Whenever you declare a new variable, Java will take care of it for you. So it will know exactly where in the memory this variable is. And say, for example, once you are finished with the function, Java will automatically destroy that variable so it doesn't clog up your RAM, right? It gets rid of all the variables that are unneeded from your memory. You never have to worry about that. So that's the beauty of the JVM. With a C++, you have to constantly make sure that you don't run into these issues where you forget to garbage collect or get rid of and delete these variables. Or if you do garbage collect and delete a variable and you need to reference it later, you could end up running into pointers that point to locations that no longer exist, right? You're trying to access a variable that no longer exists. And so C++, while it's very quick, in my opinion, I think it's just a little too difficult for me. Maybe for some of you guys who are way smarter than I am. I'm sure that wouldn't be an issue, but for me at least, it's a little bit difficult. What I like about Java, though, personally, is that it uses something called a JVM. So what does that mean? It's a virtual machine. So in another issue with C++, I'm just going to go back to that, is that once you compile it, you have to compile it for the specific processor that you have. So in each computer, we use different processors. The processor that's on your phone is different from the one that's on my PC, which is different from the one that's, say, on a Mac, right? They all run and read opcodes differently, which is basically the binary differently. And so with C++, because you're essentially natively talking to the CPU and telling and giving instruction sets to the CPU about what to do, the problem with that is that the code that I compile, say on this computer, it will not run on a Mac and it will not run on your phone or Linux, and vice versa. If you have a Mac and you compile a C++ code, then it won't work on other distributions. So sometimes you'll see when you're downloading, say, a file online, you'll see different installers, like a Mac installer, and then you see an x86 installer, you'll see an x64 installer, you'll see an ARM64. I'm sure you guys have seen these sayings before. Essentially what it is that because the code was compiled differently, it's going to work on different machines. You have to select the right processor. You have to select the right binary type based off of the processor that you have. With Java, however, if you can install Java on your machine, it is guaranteed to work. How does that work? Essentially, we have something called a Java virtual machine. Essentially, it takes your Java code and it will automatically compile and convert this code into something your machine can run at runtime. So once you compile it into a Java jar file, as long as your machine can run Java, the JRE or JDK, it will always be guaranteed to work. So that's also another big thing that I like about Java, is that it's kind of robust and it's able to work on any machine. One of the only downsides that Java has, in my opinion, is that it's quite verbose. So in order to create a function, for example, in Python, for example, you just put something like def, but in Java, you have all these words in front of it. You have to declare each variable, and on top of that, you have getters and setters on each object. So that can get a little bit difficult. So just a little bit of a kind of like heads up on the differences between Java, C, and Python. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of different languages out there. Stuff like Ruby exists, and Ruby is a great alternative because it has a garbage collector, but it also runs natively on machines, so it's almost as fast as C is, right? And there's a whole bunch of other languages like JS and whatnot, and they each have their own pros and cons. So before picking and sticking with a language, I would highly suggest that you guys do additional research and see what companies are really into, and not just what companies are into, but maybe the pros and cons of each language. I'm sure during interviews, people will ask you, hey, what's the difference between these two code types? Or why do you select Java over Python? Or what are the pros and cons? Say if they gave you a new project to build, why would you select this specific language versus this specific language? It's not only important to know how to use a language effectively, but it's important to also know which language to select, because that can be a very big part of your building block. But I don't want to get too deep into that. That can be a whole rant, right? And obviously there are infinite different amount of coding types to use, right? So just want to give you guys kind of a heads up just to kind of answer Mo's question. But anyhow, it's so nice to see you guys back. I remember last time we had this issue where I wasn't able to run API endpoints on my computer, but we got that resolved. So we had our add endpoint, and I had my hello world endpoint, and previously I had over here at controller. Well, it seems like actually on Spring 3 they updated it. So instead of using at controller, we're using the annotation at rest controller instead. So now you see if I go ahead and I rebuild my project and I rerun it, if I hit the hello world endpoint, it's going to return as expected. All right, sample application has started. And if I do localhost 8080 hello world, and I go ahead and hit send, you will see that it returns the string hello world. exactly like what we said over here, right? All right. So let's do something a little bit more complex because we already have an endpoint that adds two numbers using get mapping, right? We have integer one, integer two. And while that's great, and I'll give you guys a quick demo here as well. If I have the localhost 8080/add, and I add in the parameter section, I add one and number one as one and number two as two, and I'll show you guys where that is. Sorry about that. If I go ahead and I subtract this, you'll see over here, I'm requesting two parameters, right? One of them is number one, which you can see over here, and the second integer is number two, and I set the value as 1 and 2, and I send it over, then essentially our function will return the value of number 1 plus number 2 together, and that gives us 3. And not only does it work for 1 and 2, if I add 99 and say 1 over here, and I send it over, 99 is set as number 1, and number 2 is set as 1, so when we add those two together, we get the expected response as 100. So a lot of times in web development, we don't just return a raw value like this. We return something called a JSON. And a JSON is basically just a way to format values. So it's very easy for computers to get back a response and parse certain objects that we want out of that response. And so JSONs, I will give you an example here. Let me see if I can find a sample JSON response. Here's a sample JSON response here. Let's take something very simple here. You can see over here, for example, this is a response. You'll see that it will return the name and whatever the name is in over here, right? The ID, the customer service ID, and the timestamp. So instead of creating like a random string, we know inside this JSON very, very easily, computers can read that exactly what's what and where's where, right? And so we're going to do that same exact thing today, except for we're going to do it on the calculator end map here. So the first thing we're actually going to do is we are going to take in a JSON. And so we're going to take in a JSON of two values, right? A JSON of the first number and a JSON of the second number. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and create an object. So inside here, I'm going to create a folder called model. So usually inside the model, it's DTOs and other objects that we might be using in our program. So over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new object called calculator request. Okay, we have a calculated request object, and we're going to put in two variables of integer 1 and integer 2 here. So get rid of that. Get rid of that. All right, so now we have two variables, number 1 and number 2. And inside our object, normally speaking, we would create our constructor. So if you guys remember what a constructor is in order to create a new object inside our inside another class, essentially, we have to say something like calculator request variable 1 is equal to new calculator request, and then afterwards in our constructor we can tell it what variables we want to take in and how we want to set it. And usually we also have if we're going to set this as a private variable, right, then we have getters and setters. And the problem with that is that it gets very, very because there's so much boilerplate code, there's way too much code for something very simple. And you can imagine if your JSON becomes, say, has 20 or 100 variables, you setting getters, setters, and different constructors for all those 100 variables, your very, very simple class can become extremely crowded very quickly. So actually, that's the exact reason why we decided to use something called Lombok. And I believe I showed you last time inside our pom.xml, we have Lombok imported. Let me see if I can find it. There it is right here. You can see how we have Lombok. And so what is Lombok? Lombok is essentially a specialized compiler. And what this specialized compiler does is that it allows for people to skip using all these boilerplate codes. Essentially, we can have the compiler automatically generate the all this boilerplate code for us. And I'll show you how we do that. Over at the very top, right before we declare the class, we're going to do at no_args constructor and at required args constructor and at all args constructor. So what do these three mean? So the no args constructor is basically it creates a constructor where there are no arguments taken. So it's essentially the exact same thing as this line right here, public calculator request right here. It is this one line over here does functionally the same exact as this line. All args constructor means that we're taking in all the arguments, that all the variables that exist inside our class. So in this case, we'd be taking an integer number 1, integer number 2, and this dot number 1 is equal to number 1. This dot number 2 is equivalent to number 2. And required all args constructor just means that if there is a private variable that requires you to create to import in manually in the constructor, it's going to only put in the private variables. So in this case, we can actually just skip that. Over here, you can see that it's redlined because you've told the compiler to go ahead and create an all args constructor, but we've already done it below. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and remove it, and you'll see that the issue disappears. So it's great. Now we have all these constructors in just 2 lines, but the next problem is what if I need to get a variable and what if I need to set a variable? So over here, for example, if I want to create a getter for this variable, usually we'd do something like public integer get number 1, and then we do return number 1, right? And if we want to set it, then we do something that's similar here, right? Where set number 1, integer number 1, and we'll do this dot number 1 is equal to number 1. So this is a lot of work, right? So then all we have to do here instead is if I put a getter and I put a setter on top of this variable for number 1, it does the exact same thing as this variable and this variable, or this function and this function, same exact thing. And say if I want it for number 2, I copy and paste the exact same thing for the second line. So then you might have another problem, right? Say you have 100 different variables in this DTO, right, in this object. Then you have another problem where you have to put getter and setter in each variable, and that becomes very cumbersome as well. So if I go ahead and I copy and I paste it in the class level, essentially what it tells Lombok is that, hey, every single variable inside this class, I want you to use the getter and the setter. So then we don't have to worry about anything in this class at all. It's all set for us. And so we're actually going to take this one step further. Some people don't like to see getter and setter. It's a lot easier if I just put in at data. And what at data is basically the exact same thing as a getter and setter, but just put into one argument instead. So now we have 3 arguments: no args constructor, all args constructor, and at data. So now all I got to do is move this over. Sorry, hold up. Move this over to here. I'm going to replace this with a post mapping, just so we can get a little bit of a sample of a post request. And I'm going to go ahead and at request body here, request body, and our calculator request. That's what we call our variable here, calculator request. All right, so now our function takes in the object of a calculator request. Now we want to go ahead and throw back a response, right? And in our response, we also want to return in JSON format. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So over here in our model, I'm actually going to create a new class called calculator response. And inside my calculator response, I'm going to do the exact same thing I did in my calculator request. And my integer, I'm going to throw in an integer called response, or yeah, response. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to return new, or you know what, just to break it down so it's a little easier for you guys, I'm going to have calculator response is equal to new calculator response, and integer result is equivalent to calculator request dot get number one plus calculator request dot get number two. And notice how I never created a get request here, right? I put add data and magically it generates the get number one and get number two. And inside the calculator response, I'm going to initialize it with result inside the constructor. And that's thanks to our all args constructor, right? And I'm just going to return my calculator response right here. And instead of returning integer here, now I'm returning a calculator response. So I got to update my function here. And if I rerun, perfect. Now that I've rerun my application, I'm going to go ahead and go into my post, man. And I think we still called it, okay, we called it /add. And inside our body, so normally you'd see the parameter section, but in this case, because it's a post request, and we told it that we're using a request body, right? Because that's where we put in our JSON response. Then I'm going to go over to my body section. And over here in my body section, we have two variables, right? We have a variable called number one, and we have a variable called number two. Oh, and by the way, guys, my Zoom session is going to end in less than a minute. I'm going to restart a new session in just a minute, and we're going to continue off from there. But I just want to demo this real quick. And once I send this over, you can see that I get another JSON response with a response of 3, exactly as we told Java to do inside our calculator response. See, we have an integer. I think there you go. All right, guys. Sorry about the brief interruption. My free version of Zoom cut me off after like, say, 15 minutes or so. So this is just a continuation here. But you guys, I think, saw a example of how to use a REST call in order to go ahead and send in two objects with a JSON object and get a JSON response back. All right. So this is like a very simple basic, but now we have another problem, right? What if I send in an invalid object, something like this, right? And then I go ahead and I click send. Well, now we have something called a 400 bad request, right? Which is what's expected. If a user sends you a response that shouldn't be valid, we should always throw back and say that, hey, this is not something we want. So I'm going to refer back to actually a guide over here. And all you got to do in order to get this guide, go on Google and search up HTTP status codes. And what this is it's a guide of all the codes that you can possibly respond back. So originally, when our code was working, right? Say if I send this over, and I think I might even be able to just send in raw numbers. I think that works too. Yeah, so if I send in a valid response, what's going to happen is it's going to 200 OK. But notice how if I gave it something bad here, something like this, then it's going to give me a 400. So what do these status codes mean? So the first 100 to 199, there aren't 99 responses in between. As you can see, there's only 3. There's 100, 101, 102, and 103. But they're just informational responses. And you don't have to worry too much about it. In my work field, I've never seen these be used before. I'm sure they do pop up occasionally. Oh, look at that. Greg has actually sent us another website here as well. Perfect, right here.
Yeah.
A cat version. But just a quick thing here. 100 is okay. 200 means that everything went perfectly. Everything is as expected. 300 means that you're being redirected somewhere. 400 means that the person sending the request has messed up. So for example, if we're sending the request and we give it a string where a number was requested, then that's on us. 500 means that we messed up. So if we coded something and we didn't catch something, right? There was something wrong with the server, then 500 means that something that we messed up. So we want to avoid 500s generally. We want to make sure that if there is an error, a 400 is thrown back. And ideally, if everything works out perfectly, then a 300 or 200 is thrown back. So you can see over here, 200 is okay. 201 means that request was created, but generally there's nothing that gets thrown back. 202 accepted. 203 non-authoritative information. 204 no content. So say, for example, if you want to submit something to the server and the server wants to say that, hey, I got this information, but there's nothing I want to give back to, then that's 204. So usually the other higher numbers of 205, 206, 207, or 208, or 226, you don't see very often. 300 multiple choice. 301 move permanently means say for example, if you're at a big company and we want to change the endpoint from add to say, instead of add, where is it? Right here, sorry, my bad. Say we want to change it from add to add numbers, right? A lot of clients, they don't read our most updated readmes all the time, right? So we don't want to just go ahead and make it disappear, right? And so if we all of a sudden we change it to add numbers, right? And let's say I restart this, and people, and then people afterwards then hit our add endpoint expecting it to still work, then it's going to freak out and it's going to say, hey, 404 not found, right? That's not a good way to map our endpoints. Then instead, we might say, hey, it's been moved permanently to another location. We might throw a 301 instead of a 404, right? 302, 303 means found. 304 not modified. So another thing is 302s found. Generally, that can also mean a redirect. And this is a permanent redirect. It's different from a permanent redirect. Say, for example, if you're using like a SSO or something where it takes multiple endpoints in order to properly finish your request, right? Then maybe it's a 302, especially if it's sent to another server. You can see over here in 400, it's a bad request, exactly like what we did. The cute cat's giving a middle finger, meaning that what you've given to the server doesn't make sense.
I never
401,
even noticed that. That's
yeah. It's funny they found an exactly perfect picture for this. 401 means that the request was unauthorized. Say, for example, this endpoint requires a API key, or maybe you do have an API key, but it doesn't have the proper authorization or it doesn't have enough credits to perform this action, then you might get a 401. So stuff like that, right? Just read through this entire guide. I'm not going to go through every single one, but if you look through each one and click through it, you can kind of understand some examples of how it's used, right? And I think this is an amazing reference. Thank you so much. Greg, if you could post this link in the group chat, and so people can
for sure.
look through it. Yeah. All right. So we're going to get back to this. So the question is, how the hell do I throw the exact same thing inside this response? Say, for example, if the result is less than 5, for some reason, we want to throw a response code. So response codes. Is it response.cat or cat.response?
HTTP.cat.
Oh, HTTP.cat. Let's pick a code here. Let's just say, you know what? Okay. Say if the numbers are under 5, we want to throw a forbidden, because they're not allowed to do that. And that's not what forbidden means, but just into this context, let's do that, right? So how do we make Spring do that? It's quite simple. So instead of throwing a raw calculator response, we're actually going to wrap it in something. So we're going to wrap it in something called a response entity. And then we're going to put these two alligators around it, kind of similar to like how a string works. And so basically inside this response entity is going to live our object calculator response. So normally speaking, if everything works out perfectly, we're going to return a response entity.ok of calculate response. And OK just means 200, right? If we look at the guide over here and we look at 200, it means OK, right? Exactly as it says. So that means everything works perfectly. So over here, though, during the integer result, we're going to add number 1 and we're going to add number 2. Say, for example, that's below 5. So if result is less than 5, what's going to happen, right? What we're going to do here is we're going to return instead a response entity of status code, and our HTTP status code, and the value of it is, in this case, forgot what forbidden was here. I think it was 403 if I wasn't mistaken. Yes, 403. And then after 403. And afterwards, we're still going to add a body of the calculator response, right? So at least the guy gets a response back, but they get the response back of invalid here. So sorry about that. I got to move this over because it was declared earlier here. And I accidentally put in calculator request. It should be calculator response. All right. So if we go ahead and run this, and that's another beautiful thing about Java is if I put this in, for example, right away it told me, hey, this is not valid. If this was Python, I wouldn't have known that was an issue until I ran it, right? So just like another heads up. But yeah, let me go ahead and enter in 1 and 1. And so obviously, if you add in 1 and 1, it equals 2, which is less than 5, right? So it should trip our response. And so you can see over here, oh, I forgot one more thing. Remember how over here we added it from add to add numbers? So that's why it says 404. So if I go ahead and I go do add numbers, and I go ahead and send this request, you can see that our response was still back because we told it to return a response of our body, but at the same time, we gave it a 403 forbidden, right? So something like that. And say if you don't want your people to know exactly how it works, then what we can do here is we can actually move this over here, and instead we can do a new calculator response. And so if I rerun this and this becomes null, right? Because we don't set it to anything, then you will see that if I send this over, the response becomes null. The user doesn't know what's going on, right? All right. Now I'm actually going to bring it a step further. I'm going to say, okay, what if I don't want to throw a response at all? I want to give this guy a big red arrow that says, hey, if this is below 5, we're not allowed to do it. Because at this current time, all I can give back is still a response. And maybe if the user hits it, then they'll be super confused, right? They're like, hey, 1 and 1 is clearly a valid number. I should be getting a 2. Why the hell is it not giving me something back? We want to let the user know that, hey, if it's under 5, we're not going to process this response, right? How do we do that? There is a very nifty tool inside here, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new package called exception handling. All right. So under this new package, exception handling, this new folder, I'm going to create a new class called platform exception handler. Okay. And then afterwards, I'm going to use this annotation called at controller, REST controller advice. That's what it's called. Yes. And so what is this? Essentially, what this is every time we throw an exception somewhere, usually in order to catch an error, we have to do a try catch, right? But the problem is if we try catch every single method, it becomes super, super cumbersome. Can you imagine if say you're running a huge platform and you have thousands of APIs, right? You have thousands of different endpoints that you could hit. And every single endpoint and every single sub method you put in a try catch, your code's going to look super ugly, right? And on top of that, could you imagine if you could try and catch for every single exception that could possibly happen, and then afterwards you would have to put in manually, oh, okay, this is the error code that you want to throw for this exception, this is the error code you want to throw for this exception. Oh my gosh, right? it's going to be a nightmare. So that's where Spring controller advice comes from. Essentially, what what REST controller advice does, and actually it should be REST controller advice here, not just controller advice. What REST controller advice does is it says, hey, when you run this application, if any method goes ahead and throws you a certain exception of your choosing, I want you to catch it and return something different, okay? And this is what we're gonna do here. Say, for example, in this case, if I go ahead and I do something like this at exception handler, and I'm actually going to create another new class here real quick first, and it's going to be called exception error. What DTO stands for is data transfer object. So it's something that people get as a response. Actually, you know what? Error response, I think, would be a lot more clear just for this class. And over here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do at all args constructor at no args constructor at data. And I'm actually going to show you guys something really cool too, something called at builder. And so I'm going to use that this time, and you guys are going to get to see how this is exactly used. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say private string, say description. And what this string is going to say is it's going to hold exactly what the description of the error is, right? And so if I do public response entity error response, and let's say here, what do I want to call it here? Let's do service exception handler, right? Something like that. Then I can go ahead and then just return a, sorry. And this is where the builder class comes in. So notice how I put the annotation builder here. Normally, I would say something in the lines of a new error response, something like that, right? But in this case, I'm going to use builder. So what builder does is instead of creating a brand new item and then afterwards setting each object inside, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something like this. I'm going to create an error response. So an error response is equal to error response dot builder. And then afterwards, in my builder, then I'm going to say, inside my builder, I want to set the description. So I'm going to do dot description. What do I call it here? Description. Should be popping up here. Oh, it's using a different error response. So notice how error response it's using from orgs framework. We want to import this one from our, there it goes, builder dot description dot build. And so what that means is that in one line, I can tell it. So normally I would do something like error response equals new error response, and then error response dot set description, right? Over here in one line, I can say, hey, not only do you want to build the error response, but I want you to set the description as number cannot be less than 5. And then afterwards, I'm going to tell it to build, and it's going to automatically build everything for me. And then afterwards, I'm going to return new response entity dot status 403 dot body error response dot I think that's done. Yeah. And over here, annotations are not allowed here. Just a minute here. I think it's because I forgot to put the this thing around it. There we go. Sorry, guys. So over here, you have to put the quotes around it and then put this in. The reason why is because this is technically an array. This is a list of all the different exception types you want to take. So let's just say if I do runtime exception.class. So not only will it catch general exceptions now, it will also catch runtime exceptions. But in this case, I'm just going to catch pretty much any sort of exception, right? And so now if I go ahead and I run this. Oh, and I forgot one more thing. Over here, what I'm going to do is if the result is less than 5, then I'm going to throw a new runtime exception, right? All right, so let me rerun this. So what's supposed to happen is we're going to send in the request, right? And we're going to have the two numbers add up and say if this is 1 and this is 1, then the result is going to be equal to 2. If your result is equal to 2, then it's less than 5, right? Then what's going to happen is it's going to go ahead and throw a runtime exception. So when Java throws a runtime exception, what we've told Spring to do is, hey, catch the exception, then go ahead and instead of returning the response entity, we're going to go ahead and return an error response. And what's the error response? Well, inside the error response, we're going to create a new object, and the object is called error response, right? And inside, we're going to build it and say inside the description, set it as number cannot be less than 5, and then afterwards, throw it back with the response code of 403. So if I go ahead and I rerun this one more time, just want to make sure everything's built correctly. And I go ahead and I send this. You can see that we've gotten the 403 as expected. The Spring handler caught it, and instead of giving us a response, it says, "Hey, description, the number cannot be less than 5." Perfect, exactly what we were expecting, right? So kind of like what we're doing here. And so over here we have an exception. Over here we say, hey, we're running a runtime exception. In the real world, when you're actually building an application, instead of using these pre-built exceptions, what you would do is you would create a new folder and then you would create custom exceptions. So you would make your own class called, say, for example, less than 5 exception. And so you would say, hey, throw a new less than 5 exception. And over here in your exception handler, you would catch it and say, hey, catch less than 5 exception.class. And if you catch it, then go ahead and throw this error. So that way, it's very, very easy. Instead of putting a try and catch statement on every single calculator endpoint, for any endpoint that that you want to have this error respond to, whenever you see it, anywhere in the program, throw a less than 5 exception, or in this case, throw a runtime exception, and your Spring handler will catch it, and you'll be all set. Now, over here, I'm going to throw one more example here. Say, for example, over here, I have a runtime exception, right? And I have a runtime exception. And I change this to some other totally different exception here. Say if I do X. Let's just say over here, I'm telling Spring, hey, I want you to catch all the execution exceptions. But over here, I'm throwing a runtime exception, right? What's going to end up happening is Java's going to throw a runtime exception, but because you told Spring to catch only execution exceptions, it's not going to catch this error. And when you throw it, I'll show you what happens here. It won't run exactly as expected, and you're going to get a 500 because your server is going to be like, hey, I don't know what to do with this execution exception, right? And 500 means that our server has the issue. It's because our coding is poor, right? So that kind of gives you an update, kind of like an idea of exactly how to use a REST controller advice to deal with errors and stuff that you expect to see coming in. Does that kind of make sense so far, guys? Are there any questions, Mo, Greg?
Yeah, I have a question. Just to go back a little bit earlier when you brought up Lombok,
Yes.
is Lombok a dependency? Like Java doesn't need it to work, right? It's just more like a tool.
Yeah. Technically, if you don't have Lombok, basically what's going to happen is you can't use the builder, you can't use data, you can't use no args constructor, and you can't use all args constructor.
So
So you
so
would have
so so it is kind of like a dependency then.
no, because if you don't have these, if you don't have Lombok, then you could customly create like public error response, right? Error
Oh,
response, right? And you could create your own getters, setters, and getters, setters, and constructors, right? But then your code gets super messy. So theoretically, you don't need it, but then it requires a lot more code. And I can tell you right now, in every single company that I've worked for, where we're creating code like this, we've always used Lombok just because it's so much easier, it's so much cleaner to use, and you have a lot more control. So it's always a good idea to have it, in my opinion. But like, is it strictly necessary? Oh, not really. You could theoretically not use it.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions? We're good? All right. I think it's almost been an hour. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach you actually one more annotation that's super cool. And tune in next time. And I guess I'll teach you guys how to use the service layer. And maybe next time we can jump into some intros on databases, because that's a huge one, right? A lot of you guys are going to have to use databases in order to go ahead and manipulate and save data. But that's for next time. I'll teach you guys one more annotation on the controller class, and we're going to go from there. So say, for example, over here, we have another problem, right? Say if I give you something that's totally invalid again, right? I'm taking an integer and I'm giving a string, right? Or not even a string. I'm going to leave this as null, which is also a valid thing in JSON. Technically speaking, null is a valid command inside our JSON. And if I send it, I'm going to get a 500 error because basically what Java is going to do is it's going to say, hey, okay, I got this request. I'm going to go and create a new calculator object. Okay, this object is null and this object is 1. Perfect. Let's go back to this class. Okay, now I'm going to calculate it. I'm going to add null with number 1. Okay, but null isn't a valid number. I can't add null with 1. Now we have a problem. We have 500, right? And so that's a very common problem. There is an annotation called at not null. No, not null. Huh. Oh, non-null, there it is. I think it's either this one or it might be a different one, but we'll see in just a minute here. And over here, we're going to use at valid. Okay, so there are different variations. Some of them say at validated. Some of them use at valid. It depends. But essentially, what the idea behind this is basically this what I'm telling them is this. Hey, so when you get these two objects, make sure that this object is not null, and make sure that this object is also not null. And when you go back, hey, before we even continue after this line, I want you to go ahead and validate it. Make sure that all the constraints that I put in, so not null and not null, are indeed true. And if both of them are not true, perfect, continue. If there is an issue, then go ahead and throw an exception, right? And obviously, as we know, once we throw an exception, we can then go ahead and go back to our advice class, our platform exception handler class, and add it inside our exception handler and create a new case where if something doesn't pass validation, what are we going to do? We're going to throw a 403, right? A 400. We're going to tell the user, hey, middle finger here, the request that you gave us was not valid, right? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to rerun this. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and throw this in. And you can see over here, okay, you know what actually I'm going to do here? I'm actually going to go ahead and comment this out. Sorry, I just got to rerun it one last time here. Just so I can kind of show you guys what exceptions being thrown here. Oh. Okay, what I'm gonna do here is something like this. Just because I forgot what the exact exception name was, I just got to catch it real quick. One moment. All right. All right, so this is the exception name. So it's called HTTP message not readable exception, right? And so over here we can see that number one is marked as non-null, but is null, right? Because we literally told Spring, hey, number one cannot be null, right? But we sent it in as null. So now Spring says, hey, this is it's not valid, right? Number one is marked non-null, but it's null. So now instead of throwing this scary error message, 400 is correct, but instead of saying this, I want a custom error DTO, something that we created. Remember over here how I have a custom error response, right? Description. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, hey, in the exception class, I'm going to pretty much copy this verbatim, right, over here. But hey, instead of catching a runtime exception, I want to catch a HTTP message not readable exception, right? So this thing. And I'm going to do invalid response request handler. I misspelled handler over here. Perfect. Okay. And over here, what I'm going to say is, hey, return this. And the description is going to be your response is not valid. And in this case, instead of a 403, I'm going to say 400, right? And if I stop and rerun this, in theory, what should happen is that if I go ahead and I send this thing, it says, hey, see, your response is not valid, exactly like what we wanted. And if I send it as 1 and 1 and I send it, number can't be less than 5, right? And if it is more than 5, say 5 and 1, that's 6, right? Then the response is 6 as per usual. Say 200 for the valid response, less than 5. Remember how we told it, hey, to throw 403 forbidden, 403 forbidden. And if we say null anywhere on any one of the non-null fields, right? And I send it over, 400 bad request. So that's more of an update on how to send proper, accurate responses back to users using both post mapping. And this same thing can apply to get mapping, right? Over here, obviously I have it at post mapping, but if I change it to get mapping, then you use the get request instead, right? Same idea, different response. So that kind of concludes our lesson for today. Mo, Greg, do you guys have any questions so far, or does it all make sense?
I wouldn't exactly say it makes sense because I'm so new to this, but it's coming together-ish.
Ish. Okay. Is there any part that kind of confuses you? I'm sure a lot of people have similar questions, and I can kind of answer it.
No, I just honestly need more practice and familiarity.
Sure. I think what I can do here is, because this project works, I'm going to go ahead and upload this on GitHub. I know I go through this pretty quick because, in my opinion, like in my head, it makes sense, right? And I think it takes some time for you guys to mess around, and I want you guys to play with my code and really mess around with it and see what happens, right? What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and upload this on GitHub or in a zip file, whatever's easier. I'm going to go ahead and upload this and post this on our channel so you guys can download this code, run exactly on your system, and see what happens. And play around. That's the best way to figure out exactly how code works. So hopefully that might give you guys kind of like a heads up.
Cool. And hopscotch works the same as Postman, right? Because that's what you use. That's what this is.
Yeah, well, I'm only using hopscotch because it's free. I don't want to pay for it. But if you want to use Postman, or God forbid, if you want to use anything else, as long as it's able to run API requests, and anything works, right? You can even use curl like what Greg was using the first time. As long as you can read it and you can send the exact same request, it will always work theoretically.
Okay.
Yep. Any other questions?
So just on the controller class, right?
Yeah.
You go to, I think, like line 22 around there.
This one, exception. Oh, on the controller class.
Of the controller.
Yes.
22. So, well, I guess explicitly line 23, right? When we're throwing that.
Yes.
The annotation that you have in platform exception handler,
Hmm.
that's where I'm using air quotes now, like where line 23 is going after it throws. It's
Yeah.
being
Basically,
caught by
so
those.
there's a giant pool, and essentially your request has now been aired out, right? So Java now says, hey, this request has an exception. And so before we let Spring deal with this by itself, what Spring does is says, hey, let's take a look under the REST controller advice, right? If we have a annotation here that says, hey, any sort of runtime exception, right? Let me know about it. Then we're going to go ahead and instead run the code underneath this, and that's how we deal with errors.
Okay.
Yeah. And so over here, obviously in this code over here, I'm catching anywhere in the code. If anything ever throws an HTTP message not readable exception, then this code's going to run instead. If anywhere in the code a runtime exception runs instead, then this code's going to work. And it's not only inside the controller class. It could be anywhere inside the code. This will always work. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. That's so
It's like
weird.
a giant
I've never used
try
that
catch.
before.
Yeah. It's like a more pretty giant try catch for every single item you could possibly think of.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Cool. Any other questions?
Oh, I have one. You are gonna with this recording gonna where do you post these recordings again?
Oh, usually on YouTube, and I post a link.
Oh, okay, right on.
Yeah. This one might take a little bit longer because the last meeting ended, so I have to join the two together. I'm sure there's some tool out there that I can use, but I'll figure that out.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Right on.
Cool. Anything else?
Nope.
Nope.
All right. Well, I'll look forward to seeing you guys next time. I'll teach you get about SQL databases and whatnot. By the way, Mo and Greg, have you guys ever used MySQL before, or is
Yeah.
that something that's completely new? Okay, so Mo has. How about you, Greg?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. I think I'll still go through it very briefly, but nothing too in depth. If you guys need to brush it up, I can post a link on the channel, and so you guys can kind of catch up on it again. But I think we'll just go from there. Thanks for joining, guys. I appreciate it. I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to stop my screen recording and post.